All right, welcome everyone. Another edition of SpectrumCast, specifically Modern Data Protection SpectrumCast. Joined by the regular crew here, looking forward to having a conversation with you. We have our co-host Randy Arsenault, and we're joined by Tricia and Sean. How you guys doing today?
Good.
Splendid.
Everybody's splendid. We hope you enjoyed last week's conversation with Fraser McIntosh around the difference between SAN and LAN-free backup. And again, you can catch those on LinkedIn, the IBM community channel, the Storage Alchemist blog, as well as in LinkedIn in the Spectrum Professionals group. So hopefully you're able to see those. You can actually catch it on YouTube as well, if you'd like. This week we want to talk a little bit about long-term data retention. More and more, we're hearing from customers who obviously, I'd like your guys' opinion, never like to throw anything out. More and more businesses are falling into that regulated industry, or they have corporate governance that forces them to keep data for longer periods of time. And I think folks are struggling. How do I do this and maintain costs? It's not the most important piece of data that I have. So recovery in seconds might not be super critical, but I need to keep it. I'm told to keep it. How do I keep it for long term and keep it safe, keep it available, but do it at a cost that's affordable for my organization? So IBM has a bunch of different capabilities that allow you to do that, which we'd like to go through today. And Tricia, why don't we start off with talking about how Spectrum Protect in and of itself as a protection tool can help clients do that?
Yeah, so Spectrum Protect has a couple of different layers of archive and long-term retention. The first one is we've always had an archive class where instead of backing up data that's kept by the number of retention, number of versions that are being retained, we can retain the data based upon a specific amount of time, and that's our archive. You add to that, we then introduced something called SSAM, which was renamed from System Storage Archive Manager out to Spectrum Protect for data retention. And it becomes more of a lockdown system, which is really great for compliance when you have to be able to prove that that data was not tampered with. And so this is basically a Spectrum Protect server, but it has a toggle on it that puts it into this lockdown mode. And then any data that it receives, you basically can't delete it out. And so it works well with like a content management solution that'll feed it the data and tell it how long to keep it. And then most recently, what we've introduced is our retention sets. And those are awesome because with retention sets, you're taking the already backed up data and you're creating a retention rule that says, I want to retain this data for a specific amount of time. So once that data versions off from the backup, if it's in a retention set, it's then maintained until that retention set expires. And that has met a lot of customers love that because they don't have to reback it up or remanage it.
And Tricia, just to hit real quick, in that locked down version that you talked about, is that similar to like a worm type capability? Meaning once I write it in there, I that's it. I can read it, but I can't write any, and I can't erase it or move it around.
Correct. It's much like a worm. The different technology it supports, it does have actual worm technology it supports, but it's also a worm in the sense that the metadata that surrounds like the policies and surrounds the amount of data time that it's retained is also locked down.
So it seems like there's a couple of things that differentiate this kind of compliant long-term storage from more general purpose like cold archive or deep archive. And one you just touched on, which is immutability, right? So you might have a compliance requirement to ensure that the data is unchangeable and undeletable. And the second really has to do with chain of custody. So you've got to be able to show where it originated, who touched it, how it changed, and what its whole kind of life history was prior to going into that, immutable long-term retention state. So are those requirements I guess those are kind of unique, and almost by definition, when you combine those two things, you get a compliant long-term archive, right? I mean, is that a simple way to think of it?
So we're really careful about the word compliancy because all of the different regulations have such different requirements. So like if you say, are you HIPAA compliant? Are you whatever compliant? IBM is very careful to say, here's what we do. You need to figure out with your folks if that meets the check boxes for these different protocols. So just to be careful on
good
that.
point. There's a lot of industry specifications around that. Yeah.
Exactly. And then, but yes, it does like our retention sets, which would be a little bit less locked down than our Spectrum Protect for data retention solution, will hold all of the activity log entries. So who created, who deleted it, who moved it to tape, who did whatever, that is maintained also for the life of that retention set to help with the chain of being able to verify who did what to what.
Okay, so that's great around Protect, and we understand how Protect can also help with now with archiving. IBM also has a solution called Spectrum Archive, and through a little bit of research, we understand, and we have a lot of clients using Spectrum Archive. And I think, Randy, to your last point about, hey, I want to archive something and make sure I have that chain of custody and living up to that term of compliance and what we are careful to say. Clients leverage Spectrum Archive, and Spectrum Archive, more of a journaling aspect, keeps track of the metadata, and we're going to touch on metadata here in a second because I had an interesting thought, but keeps track of that metadata and can migrate data to tape pretty easily, and it integrates, Randy, I believe we found it integrates with LTFS, which is another unique technology from IBM where we can actually put a file system on top of tape, helping to find things a lot easier, right? And we keep that journal. And Sean, I think you pointed out we can actually go find information a lot easier if you've got hundreds of tapes.
I think Spectrum Archive is the principal implementation of LTFS, or one of them, right?
Right. And that allows us to kind of find information very, very quickly that might be stored on tape rather than having to mount tapes over and over and over again to find something that we might be looking for, especially if you're in some form of regulated industry and you got to go find something to help appease the lawyers, so to speak. But this whole term around metadata and compliance kind of had me thinking about something else. This seems like it might be another great opportunity to take advantage of Spectrum Discover and its integration with Protect. Do we think?
Yeah, so Spectrum Discover does have some interfaces with Spectrum Protect, and around archive, it can, for instance, give you what's being the retention periods and how much of your data is being retained. And I think that's something they could definitely even go even further with their metadata cases.
So what advice or what thoughts do we give clients who are thinking about, hey, I've got a lot of data. I'm told don't throw anything away. I utilize Spectrum Protect. What are some things I should be thinking about when thinking about how to store data for long term?
I think the first, go ahead, Sean.
Go ahead, Tricia.
I was going to say the first thing that you got to do is you've got to define what does archive mean, because archive is one of those words that's pushed around and has a lot of different meanings for a lot of different people. In fact, we even see people using archive with what we call our space management solution, where I'm taking the production copy that's on your production machine and I'm moving it off to Spectrum Protect and replacing it with a little stub file. And we don't call that archive, even though it is moving it to a lower cost storage. So then you start looking at, okay, well, archive, if it's not space management and we're looking at retaining it, is it being retained for the retention purposes or compliance purposes? What are the locks I need around that? So I think the first step is really define what your company means by archive.
Good advice. Sean, you were going to say?
I was going to say, for me, what comes to mind is the cost, right? I mean, I have worked with so many customers and so many administrators who have the typical unfunded mandate, right? Somebody somewhere has agreed to keep something forever, but not come up with a nickel or a dime or a dollar to do this, right? So as architects, we need to, when we're architecting these systems, we need to ask ourselves, what are we keeping? How much data is it going to be? How much is this going to cost? And how we're going to fund that mandate? Because just, saying it, writing down on a piece of paper that you're going to do it doesn't really solve the problem, right? You also have to have the funding to be able to support that storage, be it in the cloud, be it tape, be it COS, whatever it is to meet those requirements and meet those SLAs.
Yep, and this has to be, that's a great point, and it's one of those costs or one of those initiatives that doesn't have an immediate payback, and in fact, it's more of an insurance policy, I guess, right? So you would hope that you'd never have to actually rely on it, but if you're in a highly regulated industry, financial services, healthcare, public sector, it's really expensive if you don't have it when you need it, right? So, which is a difficult case to make, right? Because sometimes you're trying to justify the costs and this investment without an obvious TCO or ROI model that you can apply to it. But again, if you don't have it, that is potentially hugely problematic. So I guess here again, and we talk about it a lot, this is another great infomercial for tape, right? Because tape is still the most cost-effective medium for storing large volumes of data over long terms. And it's also arguably the most reliable in the sense that it's, offline, quote unquote, physically air gap. So it's, not subjected to the same risk of disruption or alteration or some kind of a change. So.
Well, I was going to say that brings up another thing that I love to ask when I'm faced with these situations, which is reliability and how long are these systems going to last, right? It always tickles me when I speak to somebody and you ask them, well, how long are you going to keep this? And their response is, well, we're going to keep it forever, right? Forever is a very, very, very long time, right? And when you start looking at some of these storage mediums, storage systems, pieces of software, most of their expected lifespans at best, and tape is one of the better ones of them, right? Is, 20 years, 25 years, 15 years. That's a long way from forever.
Yeah, which is another reason why, at least in my view, LTFS is so cool, because LTFS makes, as I understand it, and this is my probably simplified view, but LTFS essentially makes a tape cartridge like self-cataloging or self-descriptive, right? So you can take that cartridge 100 years from now, stick it in an LTO compliant drive, and it's self-documenting in effect, right? So you don't require the decoder ring to figure out what's on it, which is pretty important. So that's a pretty significant advantage that LTFS has, I think.
I'll also make an argument here for IBM and Spectrum Protect and our technologies, right? Having a company that you can rely upon that's been around for 100 years, 25 years, in this type of scenario is very important, right? I mean, if you go with some Johnny come lately, are they going to be here 10 years from now to help you with that? Is that hardware going to be here 10 years from now to help you retrieve this information? In a lot of cases, it's turned out to be, the answer is no, it's not, right? And you're, in that case, you're left holding the bag.
And that brings up two things. With Spectrum Protect, if you're writing it out to tape, is you talked about the 20-year maybe lifetime of a tape, but Spectrum Protect has the ability to move that data to new technology as you introduce that into your environment, and to reclaim the space as those retention sets or archived files expire off of tape, which it becomes key in the, it's been 30 years since I archived this and I need to now retrieve it.
Yeah. And so policy driven, right?
Right. And it comes to the case of, if you're putting these archives or retention sets out to the cloud, what's the cost of keeping that in the cloud, and what's the likelihood that that cloud provider is going to be there in 40, 50 years? I don't know. It's somebody else's computers.
I think I've been paying Amazon $38 a month for the last 900 months. So, yeah, I think if I looked at the overall storage costs of that, I'm probably not doing so well.
Yeah. It'd probably be cheaper to dig a hole in your backyard and line it with lead and just put tapes on there.
Oh, that kind of brings us, or if you remember when Cyrus is here, one of the things he points out is when we do these cost analysis, we project out 5 years, 7 years, right? And now we're talking longer than that. Now we're talking 15 years, 20 years longer, right? So it's really important to look at those cost projections and decide if you're really serious about keeping this information for that long, how much is it going to cost me to keep it, and am I willing to even say that I'm going to do that?
Yeah. And that goes back to Tricia's point, which I actually didn't think of this, and it's a really important point, is that with Protect and the infrastructure and the ecosystem around Protect, you have the ability to constantly kind of, as generations of technology become available, you can migrate archive or long-term cold archive data onto newer technology, which might be, even more reliable. So you'll have some, 3D, short wavelength holographic storage device that'll, pack 100 petabytes into a cube the size of a sugar cube, and it'll last forever. So that's important too. You don't want to be locked into a particular technology which may not have the durability or the life cycle of what's coming next.
Which brings up the question:
you think the technology is getting more reliable, or is it getting less reliable?
It's funny you should say that. I heard a fascinating story on NPR. This was literally yesterday. They were talking about, if you remember, and this was like 20 years ago when the big unintended acceleration lawsuit against Toyota happened when they first started rolling out hybrid vehicles, and there were multiple cases of like accelerators just sticking and people getting in crashes, and it resulted in this huge lawsuit. Well, after years of research by like all these academic institutions and research bodies and manufacturers, they determined that it was most likely the result of bit flips, which were the result of cosmic rays. And this is true. This is actually a true thing. So there is the possibility that any technology can be affected by cosmic radiation, which hits us all the time, generally doesn't do anything. But if just the right bit flips at just the right time, it can create catastrophic events, which, by the way, is why most cars now have 2 or 3 level redundant systems for all mission critical control systems. So long story, but the point of it is that the technology is always going to be susceptible to some weird disruption like that. So it helps to have a policy driven long-term storage policy or long-term storage model, so you can recover from weird stuff like cosmic rays, for example.
Well, and we can store the data, but then the question comes of, okay, if it's a DB2 database and you're trying to recover it back in 40 years, do you have that version of the DB2 database that it was originally created on? And so it's not just the storage, it's the application software that also has to be, as well as the operating systems or whatever else.
Which brings up another good point.
It's a very challenging problem, right? It's not an easy thing.
Yeah, Tricia, your point is very good to solidify what Sean was talking about when it comes to, IBM having been around for so long, and the things we think of aren't just for how do we solve the problem for today, but you got to look out into the future, right? And we've seen requirements from history, from 100 years of history, that dictate clients need or want to have these types of use cases, from longevity of retention and that sort of thing. And it's not just, can I keep it? The question is, can I bring it back, right? And when I bring it back, can I use it, right? Is it usable? Because just storing it to have it is one thing, but storing it to use it because I need it for some application purposes, and that could be, today with big data and AI, I want to do some analysis, trending analysis. I need to be able to look at that information.
Mm-hmm. Ask yourself, is your storage vendor ready for cosmic ray induced bit flips?
So should have read the fine print.
In the fine print, it says, right? So we've talked about, if we go around the horn here, right? Tricia, you mentioned that, first of all, define what you mean by archiving or long-term retention, right? That's really important. Sean, your point, well taken, is you had two really good points. One is the vendor that you're looking at or choosing for this long-term retention going to be there to help you when your definition of long-term retention it comes up and you need to recover that data? And you also mentioned cost, right, which is a key thing. And then we talked about how tape can help us in that environment because of its longevity and its storage set of capabilities. I think we would be remiss if, when talking about tape, and I'm kind of upset we didn't talk about this when Ace was on, but there's also FLAPE. So we talked about the ability to have that long-term storage, but does that necessarily give me the retrieval times that I need and that I'm looking for? But we have clients who have architected a flash front end that sits in front of tape to be able to take some repository of storage that is used for, nearline usage or that sort of thing. And then as the data ages or tiers off, it can tier to a much lower cost medium. And that can be, when it's tape, it can be stored on there for longer periods of time at a much lower cost. So I think we've highlighted quite a few things that can help clients think about this.
I think we'd be remiss too if we didn't talk about object storage, right? I mean, object storage is a relatively recent development. I guess it's not recent anymore, that has come along as a way to address this need. And many of the cloud vendors are providing permutations of this, Amazon Glacier being one, Azure Archive tier being another. And they seem to be adding different tiers at different cost levels as needs arise, right? Customers are coming in and saying, I need this for this long, and then, okay, well, we can do that. We'll add this tier. But, I think you have to go out there and run the numbers realistically and seriously to understand what the cost of this stuff is long term. Right.
And this is just a question, Sean. I think you bring up a really good point. Do we know of any examples in the media where a client has gone to like a tier 3 AWS Glacier and had to get, 100 terabytes of capacity out of it, and what that cost comes? Because you're right, these vendors keep talking different tiers, Azure blob storage and all this stuff. Great, right? And it's cheaper, and I can just push it to that tier, and I can keep pushing it down as that need happens, and I'm saving a little bit. But what happens when I need to get it? What's that going to cost me? I don't know that we actually know that yet.
Yeah, and we need like a contemporary version of truck mode, and some places actually do provide that. I mean, I use Backblaze, right? So I have, I don't know, 2 or 3 terabytes of picture data and media data that's stored there in a deep archive. They actually offer a service where if I need to do a full recovery, they will physically ship me a drive with that data on it, because otherwise it would take 3 months to, trickle it down on my connection and through the metered connections they use on their end, and it would cost a fortune. So to your point, the vendors are having to adapt and develop new business models and new ways and new policies that attack the cost problem. But for large enterprises, we hear this all the time, that part of the reason tape is kind of increasing in popularity is that as clients reach that tipping point of a certain volume of data, the data movement costs in and out of the cloud just become prohibitive. It's like, we can't sustain this. And God forbid we ever do need to do a large scale recovery like that, it would be just prohibitively expensive. So we know that it's okay to have that as a firewall and an insurance policy, but we need to have either an on-prem or a more proximal solution that's much more cost effective and reasonable than something like that.
Yeah. I mean, we have certainly heard rumors of the stories of the people who have gotten hit with the surprise bill, right, from the cloud providers, right? I'm a government agency. I signed some contract saying I'm going to pay thus and so, and somebody uses the contract, and along comes the outrageous bill, right? And it's like, oh, I never thought this was going to cost me this. Well,
I never thought I'd have to recover 100 terabytes of data.
I never thought I'd have to. and I will add, and I'm sure most of you on this call will agree with me, right, that predicting these usage patterns that you need to predict if you're going to use a cloud service is not an easy thing. Right. I mean, It can be very, very difficult to predict those usage patterns.
Yeah.
So
you only
that's
need
one of the risks you take.
You only need one edge case, to come up at some point to just completely throw the cost structure out the window.
As we used to say in the days when tape was super popular, never underestimate the performance of a Chevy truck full of tapes.
Amen.
All right, I think this has been a really, really good conversation. So things to think about, especially if you're in the archiving or the long-term data retention space, and especially if you're taking advantage of the IBM solutions around Protect, its object storage, its tape. Fantastic. Thank you all for sharing that. Next week, we want to hit on, so that long-term retention might have been a little bit of an older topic. Wanted to bring it to a little bit of a newer topic. And we want to talk about data protection for containers. Now, this is an up-and-coming, emerging kind of space, mostly because containers are emerging and pushing deeper into the enterprise and becoming much more popular. So we're looking forward to having that conversation. And, Randy, we're going to lean on you as our resident container expert and our Red Hat expert, and things we might want to think about as we go there. So, what do we got there? Look at that, okay. Red Hat. Between, what was the term today? The mandated projects that are unfunded
mandate. Yeah, the unfunded mandate.
The unfunded mandate. You always have some good terminology for us.